Just stop it. The run-of-the-mill, cheesy, humdrum bullshit status quo just tires me out. What fascinates me are the industry disruptors, the superhuman frontiersmen or women who go through hell to achieve their goals. Join me as we meet and learn from those mavericks, rebels, and business leaders that aren't afraid to piss off the establishment in order to make radical change for good. Sponsored by Johto PR, the disruptive anti-PR firm that murders your competition with cinder blocks and cyanide. This is Disruption Interruption. Welcome back, everybody, to Disruption Interruption. I'm your host, KJ, and we're here today to talk to someone who has taken the reins of their industry horse and steered off the lame, tired path. Today's guest helps entrepreneurs of disruptive food brands break into Costco. In today's consumer-demanding market, the food brokerage model is just plain broke. And this guest says no more BS. Today, shrewd buyers and consumers demand elevated, unheard of product experiences. He's been listed as a consumer catalyst in Forbes magazine, and he's coming to us live today from Oregon. Please welcome our disruptor, founder and CEO of Launchpad, Jeremy Smith.
Thank you. Good morning.
Good morning. How are you?
I am doing great. It's as one would expect, raining in Portland area, so it's a normal day.
I can see that behind you in your window.
Oh.
Wet and cold.
Yeah, it's actually nice because I lived in California for a very long time, and it used to rain there consistently during the rainy season. And for the past several years, we haven't gotten much rain, so it's nice to see my old friend again.
That's good. Well, Jeremy, we haven't talked to disruptors yet in the food industry, right? And this is on everyone's mind. Everyone eats, right? So tell me, from all the work that you have done and are doing with disruptors in this market, what is the main important ingredient for disruption?
Well, it's not one single ingredient, but or single thing. It's usually a combination of things that catapults a brand in the food and beverage industry to the top. Most of the time, it's not necessarily something that's unique. A lot of times, it's taking what already exists in the marketplace and making it better. Reimagining it, kind of like what Apple does. Steve Jobs said, Apple doesn't invent anything new. We just take what you're using and we make it better. And so whether it's someone like a Chobani, they weren't the first ones with Greek yogurt in a cup, but their approach and their relationship that they developed with the consumer, a lot of times, especially brokers and brands, get very focused on buyers because the buyers are the first person that can either say yes or no to you, really, on the path to getting on the grocery shelf. But being on the grocery shelf means nothing if the consumer doesn't embrace you. So ultimately, the most important person in the marketplace is the consumer, because the consumer will decide whether you're a disruptor or you're not. And sometimes that can come from the story. Like if you look at the Chobani story, you had two things going on. You had a new, Greek yogurt company, but you also had the story of Hamdi, an immigrant, and an incredible story of how he took over the old Kraft plant in upstate New York. So there were a lot of things going for it that interested consumers. And, Chobani was very receptive to listening to consumers. And they were also very aggressive in how they were going forward in the marketplace. And so those things are what kind of changes things. I'll give you a simpler one. Years ago, Costco sold 2-pound and 3-pound brownies, and we were working with a bakery company, and it was just when the low carb craze was hitting, and we made a recommendation to our client that they come up with something called the brownie bite, which would be a smaller brownie. Instead of going to Costco and saying, I'm going to bring you a 3 pound or a 4 pound or a 5 pound brownie, let's do something completely opposite. And because we saw the trends in the marketplace, um, switching to low carb, we figured that people wouldn't want to, go home and talk about eating a 2 or 3 pound brownie. But if they had a little bite, they probably might eat 3 or 4 pounds of it, but they'll feel better about it. And it's just a different format than what was traditionally there. And it's not as, it still had all the indulgence of a regular brownie, but it wasn't as decadent and as rich as a brownie because you got a much smaller bite out of it. So
Yeah, it didn't seem so gluttonous. I remember brownie bites. It was perfect.
yeah, and it's still around today. You just don't hear about it because it's become such commonplace, and that's really a lot of times what happens with disruption brands. But as a category overall, what's changed the most in the food and the beverage industry is that um, like companies like Kraft Heinz and Procter and Gamble used to own the shelves on in the grocery stores, and by that I mean they could pretty much do whatever they wanted at a grocery store because the grocery store was so dependent. But then all these smaller brands came out in the market, and thanks to retailers like Whole Foods, which gave the smaller brands an opportunity to get on the shelf, all of a sudden consumers began voting and saying, you know what, I'm not going to buy Kraft Heinz Campbell's or Campbell's soup anymore. I'm going to buy this little company with this great story about this female entrepreneur who's building, this new soup empire. But right now she's just 20 employees, and it's an exciting story, and so people wanted to be part of that. And that's really, again, at the end of the day, it all goes back to consumers are really the disruptors because they vote with their pocketbook as to whether or not they're going to support a brand. And believe me, if you go to a show like Expo West, which is the largest food show in the United States, 60 or 70% of the brands that launch there, want to be disruptors, but most of them will never make it very far. And so, for all the stories that you hear about brands that are disrupting, a lot of the brands don't make it long term for whatever reasons. Consumer adoption wasn't there. They couldn't get enough distribution. They ran out of money, things like that.
But consumer adoption tends to be the number one aspect from what you're saying. Like
it is, and it's overlooked too much because it's much easier to quantify in a business plan. I'm going to go out to 10,000 grocery stores over the next 5 years. It's much harder for people to talk about the consumer. And a lot of times you're getting entrepreneurs that are starting a business for their first time, and they've never marketed or sold a food or beverage brand. And another example of this is kombucha as a category. No one knew what kombucha was, but
so popular now.
Yeah, and
my doctor even recommends I drink it.
Yeah, but it's still a small portion of the overall beverage market, but it created an entirely different consumer that was looking for something very different. And you never know where that's going to come from. There was no one predicting the rise of kombucha. And there were people that wrote about it once kombucha hit the market, but there wasn't anyone really writing articles and saying this is going to happen and blah 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 blah. There were people been touting CBD, and derivatives of marijuana for quite some time, both in the beverage space and in the edible space as being a huge opportunity. The problem with it is that they're stuck because it might be legal in one state and not legal in another state, and so you can't drive a truck through Idaho with uh, illegal product, even if it's legal in Oregon. So so that's been legislation has been a barrier that a lot of these companies haven't gotten over with. So there's a lot of hype behind it, and there is promise as an ingredient. There's a lot of things that can be done, but those are sometimes things that entrepreneurs don't anticipate, and it stunts the growth of a product trying to enter the marketplace.
Yeah, it sure does. And, you know, it all comes down to the consumers, really. I mean, you said something that is really important. I want to go back to that. Consumers are the real disruptors. And you're talking about the main ingredient. Yes, these disruptive entrepreneurs, they're making things better, but they are going at it differently today through they're going at it from the ground up. They go through the consumers to the buyers, right?
Yes, and the other thing that's changed is farmers markets have become a big source for consumers to go to on the weekends, and a lot of times that's the opportunity where a brand gets its first start. They're not in the supermarket yet, and so they're selling products on the in the local areas, and there's brands that do 8-10 million a year at farmers markets, but they're not in retail yet, so you don't hear about them. The other kind of disruption in the marketplace is e-commerce. And during the pandemic, e-commerce has become a major force as far as consumers being able to find other brands that they wouldn't find on the shelf. And there's some very high quality disruptive product brands that only sell direct to consumer, and they're not messing with the grocery channel and having to pay slotting fees and dealing with distributors that don't pay you for 90 to 120 days. They're dealing directly with Amazon and some other online platforms like Box, and it enables them to go to market in a different way that was not available 10 years ago. And so all of the retailers are having to compete with that now, and it's a whole nother set of disruption, and there's different rules online. Some products don't really sell well, like fruits and vegetables, because people want to touch those. And frankly, one of the things that people have misunderstood about grocery is that it's a social experience, just like a social media platform is. People like going into the store and talking to the butcher. People like going in and touching the fruit and seeing the beautiful colors. So there is an experience, and that's why Costco's been so successful. Is because you can go in there and get free lunch, and enjoy the demos, and that's why people still to this day, as long as Costco's been in business, they line up, for the doors to open and go in and experience new products there.
That's
And
true. We
and
like our free food, don't we? Our free samples.
yeah, well, it gives you some excitement, going to the store.
Yeah.
Usually, a lot of time, it's rare that both the husband and the wife really enjoy it. It's usually one or the other. A lot of times for some people, it's a pain in the ass having to go down to the supermarket again. But for other people, it's really social. You run into your friends, and that's one of the things that really hurt the marketplace during the pandemic, is because people changed their habits and they were more free flowing and going into the store and grabbing items and not looking at some of the emerging brands, and just getting in and getting out is what we call it. And so that changed, but now it's coming back and people are going back into the markets. But it's
Well, how are these emerging brands able to get in front of their target audiences for those of us like myself, which I don't know what percentage I fit into, but I really like shopping online for my groceries now.
Yeah, I'm the opposite. I still like going into the store and walking around, and I don't talk to anybody there because for me, it's not a social event. It's more looking at the brands and seeing what people are working on and doing.
Well, this is where
Uh,
the online experience really needs to come up. You're talking about e-commerce being another disruptor. This whole online shopping experience through the grocery store. I mean, that's another avenue to even disrupt as far as the user experience, right?
yeah, I think there's some limitations. Like the Costco experience, which is, you know, you're buying a much larger box. Those get really expensive to ship. Um, for light items and dry groceries, online and e-commerce is fantastic. But for fruits and vegetables and other things, it's not quite as effective. And if you're a new item that people haven't tasted, sometimes uh, trying it online can be more difficult. On the other hand, the advantage is that online people take the time to read more, so you can do your own sort of, I don't call it advertising, but promotion online. So you can go and you see a new mushroom product and you can read all about it because Amazon has enough space on the internet in order, to set up a homepage and allow you to display your product and explain what it is. And you don't really have that in the supermarket, and you don't have that in other places. So I eventually think e-commerce is going to go down a bit, and it's starting to for food, just general groceries. That's why Amazon bought Whole Foods, is because
I do
they,
like going into Whole Foods. I do think
yeah.
it's interesting. I like seeing all the brands. I never think of produce as something new and emerging or emerging brands, but there's a
Well,
eye
it
opener
is
for me.
actually, because there's now indoor growth of plants that are being grown in heated warehouses instead of out in the farm, and that's slowly beginning to take off now. And there's more and more higher quality products that are being grown indoors, and the supermarkets are taking that in because it allows them, first of all, to grow locally, and it allows them to get product year round that you wouldn't get from a farm, because there's only certain seasons when some of the produce can be grown due to weather. You're not
And
going to.
growing locally is vitally important to consumers more and more these days.
Yeah, there's two factors there. There's the factor of, I think that some people miss the days of, 40 years ago when you could actually easily walk onto a farm and buy your food locally there. And I think the other aspect to it is carbon footprint, which, the more that can be done locally, and this is a big focus for Costco over the next several years, is to try and be able to bring the supply chain back to the U.S. as much as possible, and buy more centralized local brands, so that a product that's made in Chicago isn't being shipped all over the country. Instead, they're buying, if the buying office is in, let's say, Washington, Atlanta area, they'll buy from local vendors there more, so that they don't have a truck going. It's only going 500 to 800 miles instead of 4,000 miles.
That makes sense. I didn't know Costco was doing that. Speaking of Costco, you help these disruptive entrepreneurs get into Costco. And
Correct.
you have mentioned, the whole broker model is broke, has been broke. Tell me the status quo of the challenges and what that model has been like for so many years and been so hard for emerging brands to get on the grocery shelves.
Well, I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that sometimes, the good old boys network, if you will, worked 20 or 30 years ago, but it's different today in that buyers are looking for different types of things from their brands. 30 years ago, they weren't asking a brand to talk to them about their sustainability plans. They're looking more for that. And a lot of the brokers are used to sell, I call them PowerPoint pushers. And my comparison that I always use to tell people is, these are the guys, that go in and present and they read out of a PowerPoint. And, to me, I've always felt like that would be as exciting as going to a New York play and on Broadway and seeing Denzel read from the script. You're not going to pay $120 a ticket to watch Denzel tell you, read from the script and sit in a chair all night. And so, brokers, are basically salespeople. They rely on PowerPoint too much, and they're not strategic. And one of the things, it's not as difficult to get on the shelf as it is to stay on the shelf. And so strategically, when your brand comes out and you introduce it, whenever you're first to market with something, if it takes off, especially at Costco, everybody copies it. And so you have to know that from day one, and a lot of the brokers aren't equipped for that. They're as I said, they're mostly salespeople. They're not strategy. And I know a lot of brokers send me emails and posts on LinkedIn that that Jeremy Smith doesn't know what he's talking about. But I'm hearing these
That
things
means
from
you
buyers.
do. If they're saying it out loud, that means you do. What is the Good Old Boy Network like? You said there are a lot of PowerPoint pushers. But Good Old Boy Network implies that it's closed, it's not open to disruption. That typically is, what it means in any industry. What is that like, and how has that been so difficult for brands?
Well, I think it has more to do with there's not a lot of options. So if you look at there's like three really large brokers, and over the years, a lot of the brokers have gotten acquired. The really good ones, like my last company, Level One, we got acquired. So there's less and less brokers out there, which for emerging brands, some brokers are really good at frozen. Some are really good at snacks. Not all of them are good at all of the categories. And so if you're a brand that is in the snack category and your broker that your buddy's recommending you to, who's had success with them, doesn't sell snacks, you're at a disadvantage. And so right now, there's probably, due to acquisition and brokers some going out of business, there's so much capital flooding the marketplace from VC and angel investors for food and beverage entrepreneurs that there aren't enough really good high-end brokers left to go around to support all the brands. So the service is very different between many of the companies, and so there's not a ton of cash going into helping fund more brokerage firms. So the pace at which new brands are entering the marketplace is much greater than the overall availability of options for brokerage firms. And it's been kind of done, this same way. Like, I get asked one question all the time that I can always tell the person doesn't really know what they're talking about. They'll always ask, and these are brands that are looking for brokers. So when they interview me, they'll ask me, do you have good relationships with the buyers? Well, first of all, no one's going to tell you the truth. They're going to say, oh, yeah, we got great relationships with everybody. And then the brand finds out that that was bullshit. And so they shouldn't be asking that question. The question they should be asking is, how many SKUs do you have currently in Costco? What brands do you represent? And, how do you strategically deal with the lifetime of a brand at Costco? There's other questions that you should be asking, but most brokers aren't focused on those type of things. So the same questions get asked and answered over and over again, and it becomes stagnant. And it, most, like I was talking to a potential client earlier in the week, and this guy's got like a $5 or $6 million business. He's been out there for 3 years, which is pretty good, and he's going direct to consumer, and he wants to get into retail. He really doesn't have any idea on, who's a good broker, who should I go with, and so there's not a lot of education from that standpoint, and a lot of brokers don't. It's not like it's an industry where all the brokers know of each other, but it's not like we share information. And so to me, that reminds me of kind of, I used to be in the advertising and graphic arts industry years ago. And with the printing companies, it was definitely a good old boys network where men dominated the field. And there's many more women now that have gone into the brokerage business, just like there's many more women, even though it's harder for them to get funded than men, because VC firms are mostly male-dominated organizations as well, which is a whole nother discussion for another time. But
It's
so,
true.
so when you see all these things, a lot of them are old, male-dominated industries that have, a lot of the businesses are family-owned, and that has both pluses and minuses in the marketplace for people, because family dynamics can be volatile at times, and sometimes unprofessional. But some of them work, some of them don't. So there's a lot of things going on. And if you look at the food industry, the brands themselves have evolved much more quickly than the broker networks have to meet the needs. Like today, we offer consulting. Most brokers don't offer consulting. So if someone wants to sell directly to Costco, I can help them sell directly to Costco without a broker. I'm not here to say that I have all the answers. What I'm saying is there's other options, and I think at some point the broker network is going to start to fade away, and more people will go directly, and there'll be more consultants that can help you get all of the expertise that you don't have. Costco is one of those retailers that it's a very different business than Whole Foods business. So it takes a while to get up to speed. And so I think over time, as things begin to change, more people will go directly, and there'll be more people like me who have the expertise to help get brands up to speed so that they can go to Costco directly.
That's really very interesting. I mean, that is the disruption. Anytime you have innovative disruption, you interrupt a value network. This
Right.
particular value network of this brokerage, which has been heavily in like a sales network, right? PowerPoint pushers. It's going more to consultants that are real strategists. What is the difference between really strategizing? What are the things that one really needs to do in order to help these entrepreneurs get on the shelves in Costco and stay there?
Well, normally there are some brokers that still don't allow the brands to come to the meetings, and that to me is an immediate red flag that you should just hang up and say thank you very much for your time. I'll get back to you when I make my decision. But you know, for us and how we work, we believe in a lot of rehearsing because the Costco meetings can be pretty intense. They ask. I've had a client tell me once that he's had root canals that were more pleasant than a meeting with a Costco buyer, just because they ask questions that not even Whole Foods asks, and so
They're
you have
very
to be very
pointed
prepared.
questions, very
Yes,
grilling.
they're more about Costco is an operational sell. Like with Kroger's, there were stories about brokers. I go golfing with him. You won't hear that at Costco. Costco doesn't allow any of that. Costco cuts out all the bullshit. It's not a traditional sales call. It's more, you have to be more operationally ready to talk to Costco. It still doesn't mean you do have to pitch your brand. You do have to explain things, but it's much more operational. How many units are on a pallet? How many pallets are on a truck? All of these things. It's a bit different. And then, Costco will ask you things like, where does your salt come from that you're using? What type of soil do you have? Things like that that can catch, the average salesperson off guard if they're not prepared. And so we spend a lot of time preparing our clients. We have a strict rule: never ask a question you don't already know the answer to. Which always listen. If you ask an important question and the buyer doesn't answer it right away, be okay, be comfortable in the silence, and force the buyer to answer the question, because you may find out something that you didn't anticipate. But too often, salespeople, all they want to do is talk and hear themselves, in the meeting. And brands can be that way too. But we had a situation with a client where I just knew on his personality, he was the founder of the company, that he was going to get clobbered in the meeting because he liked to talk a lot and he didn't like to listen a lot. And so, we rehearsed over and over and over again. And then we went into the meeting, and I told him, because I knew this buyer and I knew how the buyer operated, that she was going to go right to his PowerPoint presentation and go right to the pricing if he handed her the PowerPoint presentation. So I said, don't give her the PowerPoint presentation until we're near the end of the meeting. And of course, the first thing he did was handed her the PowerPoint presentation, and she tore right through it. All right, here's your offer. You're 40% too high. I mean, she just went on this whole rant. And so I had to figure out a way to stop it. I knew she was a big fan of the Boston Red Sox, so they were having a good year. So I immediately pivoted to the Red Sox, and she said, "Yeah, you're right. They're doing really well." And so I distracted her, and then we got back on track and got focused again. But so the goal is to try and strategize about that and the psychological aspect of each buyer prior to the meeting, as to where most brokers don't even think that way. They'll say, hey, meet me at the Costco office in Livermore. Be there about 15 minutes before a meeting time, and we'll go over everything. We don't work that way.
I think that's really important, the psychological aspect of each buyer. You remind me very much of performance and entertainment, in the sense that your rehearsals is really about showmanship, but also providing the audience with the data that they need psychologically in order to make the decisions that they need logically for the business.
Well, the other thing is we try and tone down the performance and try and do things like, salespeople get into bad habits and so do founders, of saying, well, it's a great product. We go back to the old TV show Dragnet and with Joe Friday and
just
say,
the facts, ma'am.
Exactly. Bingo. You got
But
it.
that is a type of showmanship, Jeremy. It's a different, you're speaking to the actual audience, right? That's what they want. Just the facts, ma'am.
That's true. And Costco doesn't want to hear that you have a deal with Rachel Ray. There's no one who doesn't have a deal with Rachel Ray. She promotes herself so much that I get surprised when I see a presentation without Rachel Ray in it, although it's calmed down lately. But so to us, we look at the meeting differently. It's not a sales pitch. We're going in to have a conversation with a buyer and talk about a little bit about our business, learn a little bit more about their business, and see if we can come to a meeting of the minds and move forward. And we keep it really simple. But we've spent a lot of time doing the homework in advance, so that when we come out on stage, if you will, we know we are driving the conversation to get to a means and a point where we want to be, instead of having the buyer drive the conversation. We're still inclusive, and we want the buyer to express themselves, but the goal is to be able to make sure that you make certain points about your brand that's going to appeal to the buyer, and that when they walk when you leave that meeting, that buyer understands your brand and what separates you from the competition. And if you don't communicate that, that's on you. And I've seen it happen with clients where, like in kale, the buyer just says, "Well, I buy kale at 28 cents an ounce. Why should I pay 70 cents for yours?" Well, you better know that answer before you go into the meeting, because if you're a premium brand, Costco's goal is to get you at a great value, which means lower price. And um, but if you're not prepared on how to answer that, you can't just say to them, because Costco buyers are incredibly smart. Like, what happens sometimes is people will fall into the trap of going and say, "Well, we're 40% more because we use quinoa, and quinoa is at an all-time price, all-time high price." Well, if it's only 2% of your product, that's bullshit. And the buyer will call you on that right in the middle of the meeting and say, "Well, it's your 15th ingredient in here. It can't be that much of the product. How much of the product, is in there?" As to where you might not encounter that same sort of, question from Whole Foods or a Safeway buyer, because their goals are different. They want you to pay slotting fees and other stuff. So that's why I just stick to Costco, because Costco itself is a disruptor of everything, and so it's fun to work with a company. As much as it's not as much fun as going to a baseball game or football game or something like that, but there's still a little bit of fun there. And most of the buyers are pretty nice, and they're just trying to get what they need, because everybody at the end of the day has to answer to a boss, and so there's certain criteria that they have. But it's amazing if you really look at the food industry. There's very few industries, maybe the automotive industry right now, but the food industry has been really disrupted over the last 10, 15 years, and it's continued now with plant-based. But one of the things about plant-based that a lot of founders of brands in the plant-based sector don't understand is there are some unique circumstances that prevent vegan and vegetarian and plant-based products from being wildly successful, and that is the culture in the United States, because meat proteins are such an important part of a lot of people's lives, especially in the South and in Texas, where people for 60, 70 years or 100 years have, their July 4th parties with pork. And, no one talks about, "Hey, come on over. We're having a July 4th barbecue. I want you to have a Beyond Burger."
Or an Impossible Burger.
Yeah.
We never talk about that in Texas. It's true.
But you gotta, but see, that's the thing. To truly be disruptive, you have to understand all of these things.
You do. And, it goes back again to the story, to the consumers and where the consumers are. I just realized why, for me, you're so different, and how you're different than the Good Old Boy Network. I mean, you're part of the purpose of your company and the brands that you represent is they have to be doing something for the greater good. They have to be helping the world make a better place. When you're talking about what you're doing with Costco and you're bringing these brands into Costco and you're making sure that they're communicating the data, the real data, to the buyers, it's a no BS. It is for the greater good, not only for Costco, for your company, but also for the consumers and the brand. It's a win-win through all of that. And typically a Good Old Boy Network has not had that altruistic approach.
Right. Well, one of the things, and the reason I won't represent energy brands anymore, is I don't want to represent brands that basically are unhealthy. And the companies that make these products know that the products they're making are not healthy. They're not making the world a better place. And there's so many options now for people that, when I was a kid, I loved Mott's applesauce. When I was an adult, I figured out, I learned about high fructose corn syrup, and my beloved Mott's had to, I said, I can't eat this anymore. I didn't know it had high fructose corn syrup because, consumers are so much better educated today. They're still confused because you can read on Monday that eggs are great, and on Friday you can read in another publication that eggs are bad. And I love eggs, but I'm more selective about my eggs today. Like I only eat Vital Farms eggs right now because I like how they raise um, the hens and all of that stuff and what they do, and I like the taste of the eggs. And
You're making
um,
me hungry, Jeremy. How do
yeah.
you handle brands that, you know, in every industry, you could go in and disrupt and you're going to get copycatters. And then that brand or that food item becomes a commodity. And you said you go into this knowing this.
Well,
And
you know that this is going to happen to you, so you've got to, you got to remember that just because you had a meeting with that buyer doesn't mean that 6 months from now, after they've seen 700 or 800 other brands out there, that they're going to remember everything that you just told them in that meeting 6 months ago. So um, you've got to constantly be reminding them of the values of your brand and not, Pop Chips was a brand, the original owners of Pop Chips, Keith and Pat, that would go into meetings, and one of the first things they would do was remind the buyers of what the soul of the brand is and the foundation and how that was impacting the marketplace. And it was a good reset because it then was driving home again the messaging. And a lot of brands don't do that. They make the one major presentation, and then next time we're going to show you our innovation, another overused word.
then it becomes features and benefits, which people really relate to the story and continue to relate to the story. That never gets old.
Yeah, the story doesn't get old as long as it's true.
As
And a
long as
lot of the
it's
stories
true.
aren't true, then you've got a different issue on your hands. Or if the company has had issues out in the marketplace that go against the values that they claim to have. Like I remember, and I'm not going to mention who the brand is, but the CEO of the company was talking about how important the environment was and everything. And then the buyer that was with me at the meeting then noticed when he was out in the parking lot that he was smoking cigarettes. And she said to me after the meeting, she said, I don't believe a word he said. Here he is, Mr. Environment and all this other stuff, and he's out in the parking lot smoking cigarettes. If he really believes in the environment, um, he shouldn't be smoking cigarettes. Now, you could say, oh, that's baloney, blah, 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 blah. But in some ways, it was true. And I shared that information with him later, and he wound up quitting smoking. But, those are the things that buyers sometimes look at. They're not necessarily always honest up front about certain things, but their values matter, and they live it. But at the end of the day, though, people have to remember the system isn't fair. So you've got to constantly be focused on your relationships with your buyers, but most importantly, your relationships with the consumers, because the consumer at the end of the day has the decision making power that will ultimately decide your success, not the buyer, because consumers will tell the buyers you should start bringing in this brand, but the buyers can't force the consumer to buy the product.
I'm so thankful that you keep bringing it back to the consumer because it really does matter to us. The consumers do drive the markets. This reminds me of a brand that I saw recently. I just purchased them. I don't know if you know anything about them or if their story is true, but it rang true. It's a gluten-free product. I got the tortilla chips from Siete. And the reason why I bought it, was in the back of the bag. I'm a sucker. There was a family picture. And the caption said, it was an old family picture. It's 7 kids, with 7 people in the family, like 5 kids and mom and dad. And it said embarrassing family picture. And I thought, let me read this story. And I found out one of the kids, her name was Veronica, had a lot of health problems, and it was due to food allergies. So the entire family from Texas, Latino culture, had to give up a lot of the foods that they really loved, grain, like certain grains, flours, things like that, tortillas. And so Veronica made it her mission to figure out how to create those foods from other sources, right? Other ingredients that would taste just as good. And when grandma said, these tortillas are better than my tortillas, the family knew they were onto something and they started this brand, right? And it's only been a few years, but they have great and they taste amazing. But I bought it because of that. And I love it because of that. And it tastes good. It's amazing. Right. But I bought it because of the story.
Well, there you go. I know the brand. They seem to be good people. I don't know them that well, so I can't elaborate on that one. But Late July is another company that makes a great tortilla chip, and they do really, the company's been sold, but the ownership really cared about the environment, and they walk the talk. And a lot, you hear these gluten-free stories a lot. The challenge with gluten-free is um, obviously a person that has gluten allergies or problems with consuming gluten is a serious problem. But the problem is when you take gluten out of a lot of products, many of the companies add a ton of salt and sugar to get them to taste good, and you have to be weary of that. Consumer Reports did a whole thing about how much more fat and salt and sugar people were getting in their breads, gluten-free breads versus a more traditional whole wheat. And so you always have to be conscious of that because sometimes you're solving one problem and creating another problem. But the challenge with gluten-free is making a product that tastes good. A tortilla chip's a little bit easier to make taste good because a lot of times you're just not eating the tortilla chip, you're eating the tortilla chip with salsa or another dip or something else. But like pizzas, gluten free, a lot of them have been just a disaster. For
I agree.
people that love pizza, you lose that experience. I had my gallbladder removed many years ago, so I can't eat dairy anymore for some due to that, and it doesn't impact everybody the same way. But I didn't realize how rough it is when you have some of these issues until it happened to me. And then you have to start, that's why I was happy when oat milk came out because it was close enough to regular milk. Although when I was a kid, I drank a lot of milk, but then I really learned in Europe about how bad regular milk is. And I stopped drinking it and then picked up my vitamin D through other foods. But I like the fact that, Chobani has a really great tasting oat milk. Oatly has a good one. And there's several out there that are good now. And so we're getting more, again, through disruption, we're all getting more options, and um, people are addressing smaller parts of the market that weren't being addressed before. And the culture in the United States, um, as it's evolved, and many immigrants have come here, there's been a change in like LA to me, and I love LA. I used to live there. The food was awful compared to New York, where I came from. But today, LA has become this melting pot of culture from all over South America. And you've got Peruvian food. I mean, you've got incredible flavors and you're starting to see that in many of the products that are coming out into the marketplace now that reflect the diversity of this country, which I always think diversity means, you know, that we're stronger because we're open to other things. And so, you can only eat so many hamburgers and hot dogs in life, and before the doctor tells you to stop eating them. Um, and so it's good to be able to try, halal food, the people, of Muslim descent brought to this country, and Afghan food, so we're not so closed-minded. Like my kids, when they were in high school, they're in their 30s now, but when they were in high school, they weren't always going to McDonald's like I was as a kid. They were going to noodle shops and tea shops. I'm like, you go to a tea shop after school to drink tea? Why don't you come home? I have some Lipton in there. And they're like, I would never, they laugh at me, with my brand. So, but,
It is so different. It is so
it is.
different, isn't it?
People eat pho,
Speaking,
so.
yeah, pho. I love pho. Speaking of your kids, what were you like as a kid, Jeremy? Were you always a disruptor, or did you seek out disruptors as friends?
I was always like, my parents were very liberal hippies, and I was a big supporter of Richard Nixon. And I went the other way. I was a big capitalist, and I was always making money. And my parents were shocked at how much money I was making as a kid doing different jobs. And so I would say that my dad would say, Jeremy's always had a big mouth and sometimes doesn't know when to close it. So, but my mom was really like the first entrepreneur I met. And I didn't even know what an entrepreneur was when I was a kid. But she got us into this public school, that Meadowbrook Junior High, and it was a very different type of school. We had a class in communism, a class on the stock market, which is how I started investing when I was 13 years old. That's when I bought my first stock. And so I learned a lot of different things, and became very entrepreneurial. Watching my mom, after our parents got divorced, trying to make extra money, starting her own businesses, moving to LA and getting into the concert business. And, she let my brother and I run the concession stand at the concert hall. And she showed us, how by adding more ice, you can increase your profits 35% in a cup of an iced tea, and so, or a beer, excuse me, a Coca-Cola or a 7-Up. And so I had parents that taught us those things, and I was also very well read, so I was constantly reading business magazines, and I never really stopped reading to this day. So I was kind of that way, was always looking to make money, and
Well,
find
that
my
was a real
way.
disruption from your family and your background, wasn't it?
Yeah, I'll tell you, disruption that hit me was when I had a very good, with my brother's snow blowing business, as snow shoveling business in Boston, and we lived there for a little while. And then my buddy's parents bought him a snow blower, and he killed us. He killed our business because he would go out there with the snowblower, and he could do 10 driveways to our one.
Damn
So
him.
what I did to beat him was, because I had to figure out a way. Okay, here his parents bought him a snowblower. My parents wouldn't buy me a snowblower. So my brother and I sat down and tried to figure out how we could be more competitive. And we put our good Yiddish cups on and started thinking and getting our minds going. And we one of the problems I noticed is that when every time you either use a snowblower or you plowed the driveway, then the city plows would come back in, and they'd hit the snow again, and it would plow the driveway back in, and they'd have to do something. So we ran a promotion where we gave them one free driveway clearing. We'd come back after they got plowed back in, after the plows went down the streets, and we give them a free, and that we dig them out again for free, and that won us our business back.
Yeah, you dominated. That's badass.
Yeah, so we beat the snowblower crew.
So you like to read a lot. What are your crazy passions outside of work? Do you have any?
Um, I wouldn't say they're crazy. You know, some people. I'm not like I don't like being in planes, so I don't jump out of them. But I would say rescuing dogs and especially pit bulls, and I'm very involved with some pit bull organizations because it's a misunderstood breed. And you know, I like that. And photography. I've always loved photography and design. So originally coming from the advertising and design industry, I can't stand packaging that's not designed properly, or a car. Like I would never own a Tesla because you can go through go try this sometime. Go onto a Tesla lot and you'll see that 40 or 50% of the cars, their panels are not lined up properly. And that would drive me nuts. And so um, some people don't care. I have friends that buy Teslas, but for me, from a design perspective, if the window, I mean, the window doesn't roll up properly. Like I dig things like on a Porsche, the glass is actually shaped of the roof of a 911, the way it's cut. Most people don't notice that stuff. People like my friends think I'm totally nuts,
Yeah,
but
no, but it is. It's those little things, and it is the design aspects, very artistic and aesthetic.
yeah, and I love German design, so it's you know it's definitely a thing. We only own German cars now, and you know even my wife, you know, I got her an Audi, and she just said, "God, I can't believe the interior of this car. It's unbelievable." And so you know, and then you know I'm always constantly going into grocery stores looking for new products. That's not crazy, but you know you know,
That's
I
your
love
life.
my life.
That's what you do.
I love time spending, you know, spending time with our two Frenchies, French bulldogs, and going on walks and talking with them. It's my quiet time. It's meditative, and I really really enjoy that. And then
That's
hanging out with
nice.
friends when you can, of course.
So you don't foster any pit bulls, but you definitely work with organizations to help.
Yes, and we had pit bulls, and as you get older, you know it's a dog that you know you got to be able to handle, you know, a 60 to 70 pound dog that you know is pretty strong. So, and you know they're just such a loving animal, and you know that whole Michael Vick thing just drove me crazy the way he treated those dogs, but you
They
know, I
are
love
really
animals.
loving animals. You're right.
Yeah, so it's all animals. I love all animals except maybe rats.
Well, Jeremy, how do people get a hold of you?
Well, either on I'm always on LinkedIn, as most people know, and that's one way, or through our website, or they can just call me at 650-576-8803. I take all calls unless you're trying to sell me software because I'm an Apple guy, and none of those high end software systems that people try and sell you will work with it. So um, uh, don't bug me on that type of crap.
Good, but they can call you to pick your brain and talk to you about disruption in the food
Anything.
industry.
I will talk. You know, I learned a long time ago that even if the hot dog guy goes, "Hey, here, buddy, I got something for you," I listen to him. It drives my wife crazy. So, yes, I don't have a problem giving people free advice if you're a food or beverage brand and you just want to, you know, you have a question that's been burning inside of you about, you know, how things are working with your current broker, or you know how to approach Costco directly. I'm more than happy to talk to you at any time about your brand.
Jeremy, thanks so much. That's very gracious. I really enjoyed this. We could go on and on about it, but I've learned a lot, and I really hope
Thank
our
you.
guests have too.
Thank you. I've enjoyed this interview, and I think podcasts are really cool because it allows you to learn a lot about many things while you're driving your car instead of just listening to music. So
That's right. Another disruption.
yes, another disruption.
That's a wrap, everyone. If you learned something today, tell someone about this podcast. And thank you for listening to Disruption Interruption, where we transform lives, change consumer behavior, alter economics, and never accept the status quo. Ciao for now. Because we live in a highly litigious society, with America being one of the top litigious countries in the world, here's our legal disclaimer. This information is not intended to be a substitute for professional public relations or legal advice. Do not disregard seeking professional, legal, healthcare, or financial advice, or delay seeking professional PR or legal advice because of something you have heard here. Contact an attorney to obtain advice on any particular legal situation or problem. Use of this podcast or our website or any of its social media or email links do not create an agency-client relationship between Johto PR and the user.